Bona tarda a tothom, a tots i a totes. Tom i en particular el conseller, el molt honorable senyor Jaume Duch, que ens acompanya. Amics i amigues, aquest és el 35 volum de l'anuari del CIDOB. Aquest és el CIDOB 2026, editat en català i en castellà. Com vostès saben, la tasca de l'anuari del CIDOB és analitzar les grans tendències de la política i de relacions internacionals. Bé, i quines són aquestes? Ara, avui, en aquest any, el 2026, aquest anuari, que ja mira lluny a l'any que ve, hi ha 3 grans temes d'actualitat i especial rellevància. El nou ordre econòmic internacional, del que tots en parlem i no sabem molt bé en què consisteix, perquè l'estem fabricant, i només calent està a l'aigüera. Encara no sabem molt bé en què consistirà. Després, la geopolítica del canvi climàtic, però el canvi climàtic ja no és un problema de la política energètica, ja és un problema geopolític, de competència. L'impacte de les decisions climàtiques sobre l'economia internacional en aquest moment són més fortes que mai, com hem vist segurament a la darrera COP. El tercer gran tema són les guerres del futur. Això vol dir que n'esperem més, que no en tenim prou amb les que tenim, i tenim poques esperances de que s'acaben, i estem pensant com la guerra serà diferent demà, perquè la guerra també s'aprèn fent-la, malauradament. En primer lloc, el nou ordre econòmic internacional està clarament marcat per la rivalitat entre potències. I aquesta rivalitat s'ha fet més forta amb l'arribada a la Casa Blanca del president Trump, amb les seves polítiques econòmiques, en particular els comercials, i també el que això representa per l'estabilitat del sistema financer internacional. En aquest capítol, les paraules claus són globalització, fragmentació, la globalització ja no s'ha acabat però es fragmenta, geoeconomia, arancels, com no, el paper del dòlar, les cadenes de valor, les farem més curtes, això el que diem, però està per veure. Crisi del deute, potser n'hi ha una altra que està incubant. La Xina i els BRICS. En segon lloc, la geopolítica del canvi climàtic, amb les seves implicacions per la transició verda, la lluita pels recursos estratègics, que ja no són els mateixos d'abans, o els d'abans encara en són, però n'hi ha uns de nous que encara en seran més, les noves tecnologies i el número creixent de desplaçats forçosos climàtics. I molts dels problemes que tenim amb la migració, problemes o solució, segons com se mire, són conseqüència del desplaçament forçós de les poblacions de la nostra vinentesa, en particular l'Àfrica subsahariana. I tenim aquí el ponent convidat, el senyor Aromar Revi, que participarà en aquesta secció, i també el anuari diu les paraules claus. Paraules claus són canvi climàtic, minerals crítics, terres rares, són tan rares que no sabem ni posar-los noms, transició energètica, les polítiques industrials que estan voltant, tornen. Abans la millor política era la que no existe. Ara no, ara som conscients de que ens en cal de tindre'n. L'adaptació, la residència i el món urbà, les ciutats. I amb això el nostre ponent d'avui és especialista. El tercer gran tema són les guerres. Les guerres d'avui i sobretot les guerres de demà. I això demostra que la geopolítica està tornant tal com la varen inventar els politòlegs nazis, perquè la paraula geopolítica és una invenció de l'Alemanya nazi, una manera de teoritzar la dominació del més fort sobre els seus veïns. Però aquí també té un impacte extraordinari la innovació tecnològica. Les guerres d'avui ja no són com les guerres d'ahir. És increïble veure de quina manera la guerra a Ucrània ha transformat la forma de fer la guerra i el material que fan servir. També les desigualtats. Claro, la guerra no és precisament un mecanisme nivellador, sinó tot el contrari. L'intel·ligència artificial tret internacional, drons, la nova paraula màgica. Aquí no té un dron, no li ha espiat un dron a casa seva, no és ningú. Ucrània i Gaza, la Unió Europea i Rússia, la memòria històrica i ara l'espai exterior. Pensen que els exèrcits de l'aire ja no es diuen ejército del aire, es diuen ejército del aire i de l'espacio. Aquest anuari té una quarantena d'articles amb moltes infografies i entrevistes amb experts de reconegut prestigi internacional. Entre ells, sense cap dubte, tenim el nostre convidat d'avui, Aromar Revi, que referma el compromís del CIDOB amb aquesta tasca intel·lectual i política que és comprendre el món per transformar-lo, amb llibertat i amb responsabilitat. Però la primera cosa que es té que fer per arreglar un problema és reconèixer la seva existència, reconèixer que existeix i entendre'l com funciona. I el problema que tenim avui és que, desgraciadament, el gran país que són els Estats Units ja no es preocupa per buscar solucions perquè comença per negar l'existència del problema. El canvi climàtic són invents xinos per fer la punyeta i, per tant, no ens hem de preocupar. I, naturalment, si tu negues l'existència del problema, estaràs molt poc motivat per buscar-hi solucions. D'això ens parlarà també el nostre convidat, que és el vicerector de la IIHS University. És un expert de reconegut prestigi internacional en canvi climàtic. La seva conferència parlarà sobre un dels grans temes de l'anuari, la geopolítica del canvi climàtic, quin futur ens espera, i estarà acompanyada d'un diàleg amb el nostre director, el director del CIDOB, el senyor Pol Morillas. Vull agrair molt especialment a la Generalitat de Catalunya i al Ministeri d'Afers Exteriors, Unió Europea i Cooperació, pel seu continu compromís anual amb aquesta institució, així com el reste dels patrons que ens continuen donant suport. I com que jo no vull prendre el lloc del senyor Revi per fer la conferència, li cedeixo la paraula amb ell. Moltes gràcies.
Good evening. Can you hear me here clearly? So thank you so much. It's a pleasure to take so many people away from a good evening doing something much more interesting than hearing a stranger from nowhere come and talk to you. I am known for talking quite fast, but I understand from what you were saying just now that Catalan translation can be as fast because you speak quite quickly. But I'll try and be simple and straightforward. So the question for me, I guess, just now is, should I tell you the bad news first or should I tell you the good news? Well, the bad news is pretty bad, fine. The bad news as far as climate change is concerned, and I can say that with a little bit of confidence because I helped write the report that became famous or infamous because of Greta Thunberg. Yeah, I don't know if you people follow this stuff in the business, but many years ago, she had met a president, unnamed, and basically she went to the parliament of a very big country, and she said, she held up the report that we had produced in 2018, which was the IPCC report on 1.5, and I co-led the solutions chapter there. She said, listen to the scientists. Fine. And she was right then. But at the moment, that's not enough because we are pretty certainly going to overshoot 1.5 in the next few years, if not decades. The science is very clear. There was a slowdown in emissions, all the stuff we put out into the atmosphere, the carbon dioxide and the methane and all the other interesting things that our industrial and other economies do. But we're on track just now to going beyond 1.5. And unfortunately, the science doesn't give us a sense of how far it will go because it depends on how quickly we stop, fine? How quickly we go to net zero, and you may have heard this fancy word being thrown about across the world, going to net zero emissions. We were meant to do 50% by 2030. There's no chance we'll get to that. We were meant to go to net zero by 2050. That seems almost impossible at the current point of time. So basically, we're going to go past 1.5. We may actually go past 2. Fine? And the story that most countries don't tell their citizens is when they were negotiating or when we negotiate in the COP, they're not negotiating about 1.5 and 2. They're negotiating at 2.7 and 3. because that's what the Paris Climate Agreement is about. It comes from an earlier imagination. So basically, we're going to see a very, very significant change in our lifetimes. It's not about our children, our grandchildren. It's happening now, it's happening across the world, and it's happening to all of us. And this is something that we've done to ourselves, not only our generation. This is 150 years of choices that we made, which has led us here. And those choices have led to good things. It has led to the cities that we have, transportation, prosperity. We have a $100 trillion economy at the moment across the world. So all of those things, have led to this process. It's a set of choices that we've made of the current development model that we have. So in some senses, when I try and explain climate very simply, climate is not a disease that you can fight against and you can have a war against, etc. It is a symptom of a whole range of things that we have chosen to do, which are creating the problem that we have, including the economy that we have, the society that we have, the levels of inequality, etc., etc. So climate is a symptom. If you want to address the climate crisis, you have to, unfortunately, address the origins of the disease. And that sits with the economic system. Sits with the social system. It absolutely sits with geopolitics and geoeconomics and the governance framework as far as the world is concerned. And the reason I say that is, if I look at the international system at the moment, and many of you, I imagine, are both experts and very concerned about this, there are three areas in which the international system is kind of not doing very well. One, of course, is security, fine? So the international system is kind of breaking down on questions of security. We know what's happening just now. Thankfully, we've not got into a situation where there's a use of very advanced weapons. The second thing that the economic system is not doing very well on is actually managing the global financial system. Many things have been done over the last 5 or 10 years to try and bring the global financial system into alignment with the aspiration of what I imagine many people in the world would like. I mean, we obviously don't know this with 8 billion people on the planet, what everybody would like. But by and large, people want to live better lives. They want to live longer. They want to live in safer environments. They need better healthcare and education pretty much across the world. They want security and they want prosperity and they want a better life, fine? But the global financial system at the moment has nothing to be able to check and balance and orient it to be able to achieve that for everybody. And, the evidence is quite clear as well. The third one, which is what we're talking about in some senses, is the global commons. So whether it's the seas and the oceans, or it's the atmosphere, which is a lot what climate is about, there's no framework in which you can even have a proper conversation about trying to address this question. We started this discussion globally in 1992 in Rio, and we have these big conventions, and much progress has been made, but the unfortunate thing for us is the progress is not going at the rate at which the problems are growing. So our responses are much slower than the outcomes of what we do, whether it's emitting carbon dioxide or polluting the seas or putting plastic in the system or X and Y and Z. So there are three areas in which the global, let's say, governance architecture actually has a serious gap, and we've never been able to sort of address all of them. The challenge for us is climate is going to be such a significant game changer over this century that it will actually be connected to the other two. So there is a coupling when the climate crisis plays itself out. At the moment, we're just seeing the beginning. This is the trailer in some senses, whether it's the fires in some places or the drought or the heat waves. This is the beginning of something that's going to happen at a much higher level. That's why I said, should we talk about the depressing news or otherwise? What we're going to see is a very dramatic increase in everything that we're talking about, drought, flooding, fires, etc., because that's how physics and the chemistry and the functioning of life is working itself out. The good news, of course, is both from the science and the policy side, we know what the answers and the responses are like. That's the good news. We know what the answers are like. We also know what needs to get done to implement those answers, at least in some parts of the world. The question is, how do you make this happen in 100,000 places across the world in less than a generation? That is a very interesting problem, a problem that we've never dealt with, I would say, almost in the history of humanity. And why am I saying that? Why am I making these very, very big claims in some senses? For the last 10,000 years, we've been living in an age called the Holocene, in which the climate has been generally, pretty good compared to what it's been like in the earth before. So we call this a Goldilocks period. It's neither too hot nor too cold. Our agricultural systems have adapted to whatever rainfall you have. We produce food for a lot of people in the world. There's still people who go hungry, but that's not because of lack of food production. Most people have water, the quality of water is difficult, etc. So the global economy is based on a regime that existed, which is now going to change. We have very clear evidence about that, and if you read the newspapers every day, then you have even more evidence, and you will get a little disturbed as far as that's concerned. That is changing not only rapidly, but more importantly, it may never be able for that to move back. Not in one generation, not in two, maybe in some cases for sea level rise for 1,000 years. So what we call the Anthropocene, which is what we are very much part of, in which in the Anthropocene, one of the funny things is human beings have created more things now, things like this, beautiful old structures, new things like cell phones and glass and all the things that we see around that. Our material production of the human race is now more than what the natural environment creates in terms of biomass, in terms of wood, in terms of food, in terms of fiber. That was a big shift that took place 4 or 5 years ago. Fine. We produce more of the stuff that we create. And the question is, where does that come from? It comes from 3 big addictions, which have been very useful to us and have created the society that we have across the world, whether it's in Japan or in Europe or in India, etc., etc. There are 3 key addictions that have driven, in a sense, this transformation. The first one is what I call an addiction to fossil fuels. Fine. We're addicted to it. We can't get off it. It's very difficult. If you have a problem of trying to get rid of fossil fuels, and some people get upset about it. They sometimes get very upset with their governments and push them out, like you see in some places. The second thing which is tied to that is an addiction to fossil water. And this is pretty important because it means we have been able to use fossil water just now at a very large scale, primarily because of the availability of fossil fuels, because the water is very deep, and especially in countries which are using the fossil water to frack and produce oil and gas and all that kind of stuff that's there, fine. It's the fossil fuels that enable the use of fossil water, apart from in agriculture. So that's another big issue because the food system is tied to that. And if the climate changes, water changes. If water changes, then we're all in a difficult place. And finally, something that's not so obvious, much of the fertilizer systems across the world are linked to petrochemicals. So much of our fertilizers in the world, and we can see this from the crisis that we're seeing in Ukraine, etc., wherever fertilizer problems have been there, are tied to fossil fertilizers. So fossil fuels, fossil fertilizers, fossil water. This is a regime that underpins much of the productivity that we see in many parts of the world, both in the industrial system, in the food system in some senses, and potentially now in services, especially as the AI boom expands out and we have 10% of our energy going into AI data centers, etc., etc., etc. So the challenge here is we need to decouple these processes and make sure, as the world population, as it goes from 8 billion to 10 billion, a lot of that in my country and in Africa, that we don't really have an overshoot and then a major problem if these systems start actually falling apart and collapsing. So I said, we know what the solutions are, and I'll just outline them very quickly. This is the story that we laid out in the 1.5 report. We repeated again in 2022 at the end of the IPCC cycle as far as I'm concerned. 5 things need to get done. 5 systems need to be changed. The challenge, of course, is that climate is a systemic problem. Fine? You cannot deal with it by pressing a button here and doing something else. You can't deal with it by doing just renewables and doing Israeli-style high-efficiency water systems. You have to do it all at the same time. If we had started to do this in 1992, when we were at 0.5 degrees above the pre-industrial average, we would have had more space. We're now at 1.2. We're getting to 1.5 at a really accelerated pace. We have no time at the moment before the impacts start showing, not on 10, 20, 30,000 people, but tens of millions of people. And when it becomes further, it might be hundreds of millions of people. So the challenge is how quickly can we respond to that? So what do we need to do? The obvious thing. You've got to produce lower emissions. So you've got to transform the energy system of the world in every place, right? What does that mean? That means the first thing is you need to electrify it. You try to move everything to electricity because electricity is quite efficient. Now, not everything can become electric. I mean, we've got a long way before aircraft can go in that direction, etc., etc. But you need to make things, as electric as possible. The second thing is the electricity has to come from renewables as much as possible. Now, the good news in that, primarily because the Chinese have done so well in this process, is that the cost of renewables today, new capacity and otherwise, is cheaper than anything else. And actually, Europe has led the way in making this happen because of all the things that have happened in Europe in the last 10 years, creating the demand. And now, of course, the Chinese are taking over at a very huge scale. So the story of the energy transition is working, but it's not working fast enough. And it's especially not working fast enough for countries like mine or many parts of Africa, where many people still do not have access to electricity. Right? So this is my debate with when we were negotiating around Paris, and I said, look, the climate finance story is okay, but what you will really do in trying to promote global solidarity is to try and make sure that every person in the world, every woman, every child, every person across the world has access to electricity. It doesn't cost us much, but we need to finance that. Unfortunately, we got caught in other debates and that never really happened. So you need to get electricity to everybody. That's an SDG. It should be possible to make it happen. But till that happens, we're not going to be able to transform our economies. If we're not able to transform our economies, we will not get enough jobs. If you're not going to get enough jobs, you're not going to move enough people out of poverty. And that has its problems, as you know, wherever it is in the world, whether it's in the global south or the north. So the energy transition is moving, but there's one tricky problem. And that is when you work with fossil fuels, whether it's coal or oil or even wood, you don't have problems of storage because you run a car, you switch it on, there's a combustion that takes place and you can move. When you have renewable energy, because it only works when the wind is running or the sun is there, you need to store electricity, fine? And that is a very big challenge because storage has now become a very important sort of back and forth from some very large nations as far as that's concerned. So you need to store the electricity so that, now, for example, if you store the wind that's come from a wind turbine that's offshore just now, or you've got sun that's coming the roof for your car, etc., you can store it at night. Storage is a really serious problem at the current point of time because it depends on a whole range of minerals, and some of them are rare earth minerals. And unfortunately, the climate transition has weaponized that process. And we know what's happening in the trade environment as far as it's concerned. So there's a trade-off, fine? The trade-off is you're suddenly producing less that goes into the atmosphere, but you need to have the storage that's available, and we have to reimagine how electricity markets actually work. At the moment, we're used to burning a lot of fossil fuels in one place and distributing it. We have to completely change our paradigm of thinking of production and consumption. Every house, every car, every place then becomes a place to generate energy and store it locally and manage it. So that is moving, but it's not moving fast enough. That's the first thing that needs to get done. The second thing that we don't think enough about, because the climate debate often has become about warming and temperatures, etc., is a very simple thing. When the atmosphere changes, when the oceans change, there's going to be a huge change in where rain and water is going to come from. This is going to be the most important thing that you will find in the Mediterranean, in countries like ours, which are semi-arid, etc. Two things will happen at the same time. Some places, it'll rain more. Okay, places that were arid, you will suddenly get flooding and you wonder what's happening. Many places will have much less water. So you will have a problem of too little water, too much water, and God help you if you're in a place that pollutes its water, because then you'll have too little water and pollution at the same time. So the regime as far as rainfall is concerned is going to change across the world. We are concerned in India that the monsoon that drives much of East Africa, a lot of Asia and Southeast Asia is going to shift dramatically. And all of our cities, all of our countrysides, all of our agricultural systems are organized to a pattern of rainfall which has been steady for the last 1,000 years. Fine. So imagine if your rainfall doubled or it became half. How would you address that question? Along with the temperature rise that goes from 1.5 to 2 or even higher than that. We have no understanding of how to manage these systems, because these systems are not just technical systems. Agriculture is a cultural system. And when you destroy the culture and the culture cannot adapt, you have a very interesting problem. And then this is where I'll come to a little bit of an explanation of this. So when we started the climate negotiations in 1992, the problem could be solved, I would say, by about 500 or maybe less than that institutions. Who were they? The fossil fuel producing countries of the world, the large fossil firms in the world, not too many of them, you know what they are, 15, 20%, 20 firms actually control about 70, 80% of the market, and maybe 30, 40 banks and financial institutions that actually finance this process. Okay, if they had got together and we had an agreement and it fell apart in many, many shapes and sizes, all the way from Bali to Stockholm to etc., 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 we would not be in the place that we have. But given that that didn't happen, we're at 1.2 and going further up, what has happened just now? We have a problem not for 500 institutions. we have a problem for 5 billion people on the planet today, which will become a problem for 8 billion people, which basically means this will become a class of problem which we have never encountered before. We have to solve this problem across the world in every region, every place, every city. So it's not a question of trying to deal with a technical problem in one place. So London can erect a Thames barrier, New York can do something else because they have the resources. When these things change, we need innovation and social, economic, and political innovation at a scale that has never been seen before. And I think that is the interesting challenge, not only in international relations, but actually in the governance and management and social change in every country of the world. So we've taken something that could be dealt with a small number of people, and now it's expanded to across the whole globe. Of course, these things have happened before. The return of democracy in the 20th century, etc., was a large process that involved hundreds of millions of people. Fine. But this is a class of problem that's quite different. So the third thing, so I first said the energy system. The second thing is water, because water is critical. Cities don't produce water. It's critical for food. It's critical for water security. I was a member of the Global Commission on the Economics of Water, which did a lot of work for the Water Conference in the UN in 2023. And the thing that really disturbed us is, given the changes in climate, very soon, by 2035 and upwards to 2050, there may be something like 350 million people in the world who will live in regions which will not be able to actually produce enough food for themselves. So what does that mean? Locally, it will mean conflict. Otherwise, it means that you have to have a very robust trade system that can get the food to them, and the food has to be at prices in which they can afford, which is not the easiest thing in the world, especially in a world that's increasingly becoming fragmented. We could see what happened to many countries in Africa, including Egypt, after the conflict in Ukraine. Fine. So they're conjoined. The water crisis and the climate crisis are a single crisis in some senses, and it's going to become worse. So you've got to deal with the question of ecosystems, ecosystem services, water and agriculture and land very critically. That's the second thing that needs to get done. We know what needs to get done, but if you don't act fast enough, we'll be in trouble. It's slow to do this because it involves millions of people. It involves property rights. It involves dealing with, managing agricultural systems, which are slow to move. The third thing is something that we hope would actually move very quickly, especially because of what's happening in Asia and in Africa at the moment, and that is how to transform our cities to become much more sustainable. Fine? That's really critical, and because cities create so much of productivity, there's so many people who live in cities, the hope was that this can be done quickly, and because innovation is concentrated, a lot of young people are there, we can move this really quickly. This is hard, and there are two parts of the problem. In the part of the world that I belong to, the problem, or let's say the opportunity for us, is the bulk of our cities are not built as yet. India is going to be able to build environments now for 400 million people in the next 20 years. That's what my university is about. We're building a university to be able to guide the process of changing the built environment for 400 million people, which is, a little bit bigger than the total population of Europe. So huge opportunity for jobs, for new creation, etc. If you're able to get your technological systems right, if you're able to get a whole range of other social processes in place. The challenge is, if you get it wrong, you're stuck. When you build a metro system, when you're building a bridge, you're building a water system, you get it wrong, you're stuck for 50 years, sometimes for 100 years. So you have to think ahead. So you cannot design for what there was in the past. The thing about the climate is, the future climate is nothing like what you thought was happening before. When you designed for a 100-year flood 10 years ago, you were designing for something that you thought was never going to change. The 100-year flood has now become a 10-year flood because of climate. Right? So you really have to have good science to understand that process. So we have to organize and build our cities in a very different way. The challenge for us in the Global South is that most people live in informal circumstances. They cannot invest and make this happen. So there's a whole range of issues that have got to be dealt with there. In the north, and even for a wonderful city like Barcelona, your challenge is you have buildings and infrastructure that is 50, 100, 150 years old. And this is true of even New York. I mean, I was in New York not so long ago, and I know the commissioner there. They're struggling with the infrastructure. In fact, the US infrastructure system is in a mess. It's falling apart. They tried to put $1 trillion into it, and it haven't managed to do that. So basically, you have to retrofit your cities to change them around so that they can bring down their energy consumption by a factor of 2. In India, we are doing buildings that are, half or 75% of the energy demand of buildings that we did in the past. Why? Because we're building with new technology, just like the Chinese did with new buildings. You have to do that with old buildings. It's pretty tough to do that. I've done this in many parts of the world, and it's not easy to do that. You have a more difficult challenge with infrastructure because you have older infrastructures, they have to be rebuilt and revamped, and they're not easy to deal with. So we have two different challenges in both parts of the world. But if you're not able to transform our urban systems, from the energy point of view, from the resilience point of view, for water, for a whole range of other things, we're going to be in trouble. So that's the other transition. First is the energy transition. The second transition is what we call the land, water, and ecosystem transition. The fourth is the urban and the infrastructure transition. And across the world, even post-COVID, national governments have typically used infrastructure as a way of kickstarting their economy. But if you get it wrong, and Europe has got it right in many places, but there are challenges here too, you are going to be stuck for a long time. The fourth one is something that's not moving at all, and that is the industrial transformation. So very simple things. Cement, steel, brick, all the things that the built environment is constructed on, they require a lot of energy to build on. This is 150 years, and these technologies and these systems don't change very fast. But if we don't change them, and we continue to build and repair and retrofit the way that we're doing, that is going to really add to our problems that we have. And that's where we need tremendous innovation. And frankly, where the innovation is happening in the world is not where the problems are. And this is a big issue of technology transfer across the world. So that's the fourth one that's not doing well. We have to work on that. But finally, and this is the really interesting thing we discovered in the IPCC, the one thing that can make a difference quite quickly, and we learned this lesson from COVID. Before COVID, we never knew that large populations of people could change the way that they would think about the way that they work, the way that they would consume, the way that they can actually do a whole range of things. We found tremendous differences. I don't know, I wasn't here in Barcelona, but I've heard about all the things. We just met the health minister at that point of time in Spain, who became quite well known for the work that they're doing. Basically, if we are able to change our lifestyles, it's the tough thing to do, fine? I mean, some countries go to war on questions of lifestyle. I want this water, I want this energy, I want 2 cars, whatever it is. If we're able to change that, we can actually reduce our demand, our emissions of fossil fuel, anywhere between 30 to 50%. That's hard, but it can be done. And I think cities like yours, and Barcelona is very well known for a lot of the innovations we've done, have actually demonstrated how this can make happen. But the thing in that is, the innovation in this is happening at the community scale, it's happening at local government scale, it's happening at regional government scale. It really, really boils up to national governments. And we know that because I track this across the world in many places. That innovation is not becoming part of the public discourse. And it's very simple. You have to consume less. That doesn't mean that you have to become poor. You can actually be more productive. You can actually have a better quality of life, better healthcare, etc., by consuming less, recycling more, and not doing stupid things. I mean, if you have a city that's wonderful like this, which is walkable for a lot of it in some senses, it becomes possible. You don't require these crazy systems that you see in parts of Midwest America and stuff like that. You don't need these systems as far as that's concerned. So the challenge for us is, because we've lost the time, we've lost the 30 years between now and Rio, is we have to do all those things at the same time. And that is a hard bit. And everything in public policy, a lot in economics tells us you cannot do things at the same time. You have to do one thing after the other. You have to prioritize. You have to sequence processes, the financing and the institutional processes there. The challenge for us, I think, and that's why social innovation is so important, is how do you enable this to happen at the same time? Maybe not everything at the same time, but enough places to make the change. So we know that this works in many places. Every single one of the things I've been talking about has worked in some part of the world. The question is, can you make it work in your municipality? Can you make it work in your region? Because this is no longer a question of 15 heads of state, whatever it is, $100 million annual salary CEOs and, large-scale bankers. It is a question for all of us, fine? And unfortunately for us, we do not have a framework of international relations or even national governance to be able to address this, because it's a 21st century problem, fine? We're still using frameworks of governance which are 19th and 20th century. Local governments, which have the solution to many of these issues in time, and we've seen this, I said, most of us experienced this in COVID, they do not have the mandates to make this happen. They certainly don't have the resources, and because they don't have the resources, they don't have the people to make this happen, even if they wanted to do it. So if you found a wonderful mayor, a very energized population wanting to do various things, they can't do it because the national government is looking somewhere else, etc., etc., etc. So I think this is, in some senses, as far as I'm concerned, a call for something which may sound controversial, but in So we need, at the heart of this thing, a cultural revolution. And I'm not talking about the cultural revolution that we saw in China in the 90s. So it had its uses, I guess, for China. Because this is a change of how we look at the world and our role in the world as citizens of a city, of a state, etc., etc. Because it also means deepening democracy at the same point of time, setting up new forms of governance which actually take into account these processes, trying to be able to reimagine the social contract in some senses. Why should it be possible for us not to be able to get enough resources for climate finance? It's not very much. And I'll close with this to give you an understanding of where the geopolitics sits. So the fossil fuel industry at the moment is about a $7 trillion industry. So I'll just give you a benchmark. The size of the global economy is about 100 trillion. So if you're good at maths, you can see it's about 7% of the global output. Fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas. Fine. On top of that, you add another 7 trillion, which is fossil fuel subsidies. The fossil fuel subsidies across the world, including from G7 economies, are very, very large. And for good reason, because when fossil fuel prices go up, indirect taxes, and any macroeconomist will tell you that. So the full scale of the fossil fuel economy is $14 trillion. It's the largest single industry in the world today. It's the largest single industry in the history of humankind. And you're asking that industry basically to transform itself out of its own goodwill. A little bit hard, fine? Especially with the roles of economics and geopolitics that we see as far as that's concerned. So that was one. And then, of course, there was this mythology in some senses which says, okay, there's a problem here. We will get markets to fix it. Now, we've been trying to get markets are a very important instrument. I'm not contending that they are. We've been trying to get markets to fix this for 35 years. It hasn't worked. Fine? I'm not saying markets are not part of the solution. They're very much part of the solution. You cannot coordinate such a large process without having markets. But if you don't substitute that, or you don't supplement that with a whole range of other processes, industrial policy, a whole range of other things, they will not reorganize themselves to deliver what you want to do. Why? Because if you look at the objective facts at the moment, the renewables industry at the moment, the investment in the renewables industry at the moment is about $1.5 trillion. So I remember I had said 7 plus 7 about 14, roughly the number that's there. Renewables is about 1.5. It will probably grow quite quickly to about 7, fine, in the next 10 years or so. But the fossil fuel industry is also going to grow to twice its size. Fine. Got it. So the fossil fuel industry is going to go from 7 till about 11 or so. Renewables will grow very rapidly from 1.5 to 7. But that's not when the crossover is going to happen. The longer you take, because of the momentum, the further you're going to go in terms of what we're talking about. So basically, we have to reorganize the financial system. We have to reorganize our economic system. And that is what the big pushback is about. Actually, financing climate is not a big deal in some senses. We need a few $1 trillion to do this. The issue is, unless we stop investing in oil, gas, and coal, exploration, forget about taking it out of the ground, nothing is going to shift. And even some of the most climate-committed countries in the world who are making massive investments in trying to decarbonize their own economies, including in Europe, have been for the last 3 years pumping oil, pumping gas, and digging coal bigger than they've ever done. Why? Because the prices are where they are. So we have to really look very carefully at where the incentives in the system are, not for our children and our grandchildren, but this is going to come to us in the real world, and we're going to see this in our own lives. So this is a very pragmatic, real question. So the geopolitics and the geoeconomics are very clearly tied to each other. So we know what the problems are, we know what the solutions are, but there is this great challenge of trying to get this large beast, which we're part of, we're consumers too, don't forget, to try and transform itself, turn around in direction. Because, when the Titanic is going down, you can't just move the deck chairs, right? You really have to do something. You got to get off that ship because it's going to go down in any case. This is going to happen over the century. The challenge for us is to be able to collectively do that, as I said, in 100,000 places across the world. This has never happened before. Similar things that happened in the 20th century around other questions, around fascism, around democracy, around a whole range of things, let's say. Can we do it for most people in the world over this century is, I guess, the interesting question before us. So it's both a political question, it's a geoeconomic question, and a geopolitical question in some senses. And it involves all of us. So we're the actors in this movie. We're not spectators anymore. So we have a great role to play, and I'm really glad that so many of you are able to at least think about this question and hopefully tear me to pieces, because you have much better questions than I have answers at the moment. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor. It's been extremely interesting to listen to you and the way you addressed this systemic challenge and also the change of systems that we need to come to a solution. I have a couple of questions to you before I give the floor to our Minister for European Union and External Action here. One relates to countries, the other relates to institutions, and I'd like you to answer them. To answer them both, if possible. The first one related to countries is that at this moment we have a totally different narrative when it comes to the issue that we need to address, which is climate change and its many consequences. The United States denying the mere existence of climate change, the European Union still understanding that it is a problem to be solved, but somehow backing down on some of its previous commitments. The Global South countries saying this is a question of justice as well. We haven't polluted that much until now. Now we are polluters, but this is a question of historical perspective, and this needs to be addressed, and the justice inherent there needs to be addressed. So in a nutshell, there are, in this geopolitical moment that we're living, very different narratives on the same phenomenon. Forget about the changes, they're systemic. How do we build a more common narrative on the problem?
There's also another narrative in this national narrative, and that is China's narrative of saying we're actually going to do this thing and use it as a huge economic and a business opportunity. So I think that is, the thing that might actually change the way that the geopolitics and economics will work. Because as you know, this year or last year, China for the first time has exported more renewable products than the US has exported oil and gas. So when I talked about those numbers, the transition is happening, and China has used it as a huge strategic opportunity for them to disrupt what they see as an industry in which they have very little control and a lot of constraints. So you're absolutely right. The thing is, if I look at US sentiment, what is happening in Washington is probably very different from what's happening in the US. If I look at, for example, Yale has this program that's been tracking climate sentiment across the world for many years. It's led by somebody that I know. And I think the sentiment for lots of Americans is that climate is a serious question. The issue is climate as serious a question as many other things that are there, whether it's affordability, which New York came out in a very different way, or social security for that matter, etc. That's the relative questions that they're facing. So just because certain parts of the US establishment is repeating a story which has been repeated for the last 30 years by the oil industry or gas industry for a long period of time, saying, climate is not happening, doesn't mean anything in some senses. The administration hopefully will go at some point of time. Just 6 months ago, we had a huge US $1 trillion investment, which was driving stuff. And I know that because I've talked to mayors and people in industry across the US of actually doing something about this thing as a huge business opportunity, as far as they were concerned, which drives the US, the industry. So what I'm saying is that in many countries, people speak with many different voices. The dominant narrative today doesn't necessarily have to be the dominant narrative tomorrow. That's one part of the story. And the fact is, and you know this in Europe, very well, just because somebody in a position of high power says that, the sun circles the earth, doesn't mean that's actually true, Eventually, the heliocentric or the geocentric theory led to the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation. The facts will throw themselves up at some point of time. So I would say this is an interregnum at the current point of time. The United States, because of the nature of its economy, has to come to terms with this question. It's lost a huge amount of ground, and there are no magic bullets that are going to be able to resolve some of the challenges that not only the US, but many other countries of that kind have. I think the opportunity is very large for Europe, because Europe has been a leader in this space for a long period of time. But more than that, at least from the evidence that I'm reviewing at the moment for the work that we're doing, Europe is not only going to have to deal with the so-called mitigation business, the renewables transition and all the other kind of stuff with it. Europe has to deal seriously with adaptation. Adaptation is not something that happens for poor people in a poor country. You're sitting along the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean basin is one of the most dramatic basins in terms of change. 20%, maybe 15% of the cities in Europe are going to change their climate class. They're going to go from, Mediterranean to something that's semi-arid. You'll become like Tunisia. I'm not saying this particular city. We don't have that much evidence and things. So basically, I would say it would be a really good thing for Europe to start reflecting on its own challenges and opportunities and investing in adaptation. But what is adaptation? Adaptation is actually good development. It's making sure that people are not in places where they're exposed to risk. It's making sure that people who are vulnerable are no longer vulnerable because they have proper healthcare, proper housing. They have access to all the things that, in a sense, Europe has done so successfully for the last 2 or 3 generations, as far as that's concerned. Fine. And it also is about building solidarity, because eventually when there is a shock, what holds you together? What held us together in a world where vaccines were not easily available? It was social solidarity, and you have a huge amount of that in Europe. The challenge, of course, is can you come together to use the economic clout that Europe should have? So if you look at the larger narrative today, it is, I don't know how it's going to play itself out. North America deals with all of, in the Monroe Doctrine, with all of the Americas. China has its sphere of influence, right? Russia has its own thing as far as that's concerned. Maybe India's got something to do in some places. The European narrative in that space has to be constructed. And it shouldn't be constructed in response to somebody else from the outside telling you, you've got to, pay for your defense or whatever it is. There's a narrative that has to be seized and held together. And it is a pan-European narrative around climate. There's no question about that. Obviously, Finland is going to have, a bigger impact in some senses than other parts of Europe. That doesn't mean that you can't stand together. So I think there is a huge opportunity here for internal diplomacy and answering some really hard questions about governance inside European countries. The frontline providers are going to be local and regional governments, small towns, municipalities. They have to come together. You have to strengthen them to make that happen. You have everything in your favor. You've got the science, you've got the resources, you've got the innovation, you've got really educated people, and you've got a lot of young people who want to see something happening. It's not true in other parts of the world. I think we have to have an opportunity to stand together as far as Europe is concerned. And if Europe stands together for itself, I'm not even talking about the rest of the world, then it stands as an example, as it's done for the last 20 years in the climate debate. The reason that we had Paris, and the reason that Paris happened in Paris, was because Europe stood together, fine? So I think there's a great opportunity here to do things which would be in everybody's interest, including your own.
Mm-hmm. Which brings me to the second question, which is about the institutions and the multilateral framework in which we need to work to address these challenges together from the basis of these more local or regional solutions that you mentioned. And the truth is that we have a system of COPs that has been good at identifying the problem, good at addressing the issues that need to be done, and even good at taking commitments by the parties in a shared willingness to move forward. Truth is that what remains to be done is some sort of mechanism that makes it more compulsory to abide by those commitments and makes it more effective in the multilateral system to find those solutions. And my question is, are the institutions we have right now, including the system of the COPs, the right ones, or do we need to reform them or find new ways to institutionally organize these challenges?
I'm going to be a little provocative and maybe a little unpopular here in saying that, because of my own experience of seeing the multilateral system and helping negotiate there, the system is not fit for purpose, especially in the current context. We managed to do some remarkable things between 2013 and 15. The SDGs were quite a remarkable experiment, and pretty much all the countries of the world came together to build this framework, and it was a common political framework which said some pretty remarkable things, and we were surprised that there were even statements which says that no one should be left behind, right? But if you look at the SDG framework and you look at SDG 13, it is an extremely weak goal. Why was it a weak goal? Because nobody at that point of time thought that we would have Paris in a year's time and we'd have a concrete way forward, right? But what I can tell you just now is, at least from my own personal experience, we are not in a position to even start a negotiation to the successor of the SDGs when we know that across the world, including in Europe, there's a recession of the SDGs in some senses, especially questions of inequality and a whole range of other things in some senses. So the first core thing is we have to accept that sustainable development is a challenge for every country in the world. It's not only about poor people in poor countries, it's everybody, because we're talking about dealing with social, economic, political, and environmental challenges. And no single country in the world, even the Scandinavians who do very well on this, or Northern Europeans, are in a very good place. Fine. So that framework will be almost impossible to negotiate. Why is that? Because, like I said earlier, around questions of international security, around questions of the commons, on the questions of the international financial system, there is no governance mechanism in place. These systems are running on their own, driven by a whole range of forces without adequate checks and balances. And the question, I guess, for us, and there are lots of experts here in international relations, is the political settlement that we saw happening in Yalta over or not? We had an interregnum that happened in 1989, and the world changed in some senses. But if that settlement is over, with what and how are we going to populate this? Mm-hmm. That, I think, is the core question that we need to try and address. And who's going to lead in that process? Is it going to be consensual, or will it unfortunately come from a series of civil strife and international conflicts which will lead to that? Because historically, that's what the 20th century has shown us, fine? Mm-hmm. You have a conflict, there's a reorganization of a whole range of political arrangements, and then the League of Nations is born. You have another conflict, you have a reorganization as far as that's concerned, you have a P5 at the moment, and then there's a new arrangement that's born. The 21st century challenges are fundamentally different. This is a global process that needs to be addressed locally. There's a disconnect between what happens in New York and what happens in Barcelona. It needs to be connected through a system of checks and balances, incentives and processes. We have a problem here. This is like I said in Apollo 13, Houston, we have a problem here. The system is not fit for purpose as far as that's concerned. So we have to build a new architecture. And that's why I'm going to highlight again, I think Europe has the beginnings of that. You are so diverse, and yet you manage to do some things together, right? And it wasn't because of what happened in the US in the 18th century. We have to learn from different experiences. Or is the Chinese way of things the actual way to go? Because China has done remarkably well for its people. It's lifted most people out of poverty. It's going to do really wonderful things as far as, many things are concerned. Is that the way to go? We have to have these conversations inside our geographies, between our geographies, and to understand these different ways of actually doing these kind of things. Because if we don't, I think we may be in trouble, because the international system is basically an aggregation of a lot of these processes, and it's not delivering. We know that, right? The question is, what architecture are you going to build? Are you going to rebuild the architecture of the UN, the IMF and the World Bank to manage that processes? How are you going to bring them together? Those are questions that I think are really important for us to deal with. And the more voices there are in the room to talk about that and work together to make this happen, and not, use that as an opportunity to force sort of individual, national or sectarian interests, I think the better there is. Because you cannot solve this problem individually. It's the question of the commons. It has to be solved through solidarity. It has to be solved by a much larger social contract. And even though you may have different positions on that, you need to have the institutional architecture to make that happen. And our architecture, at least in my understanding, is not working. Or even if it does, after 500 million people are in real distress, it doesn't help you.
We did our best and tried to bring our small share into this discussion by bringing you here. And on that positive note, I would like to thank you very much for accepting our invitation to come to Barcelona and speak on these topics. It's been wonderful listening to you. Thank you very much. And now let me give the floor to Jaume Duch, our Minister for European Union and Foreign Affairs. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's going to be difficult to speak after this very interesting talk, but I will try. President del CIDOB, vicerector, director de l'Indian Institute, amics, amigues, autoritats. Bona tarda, és un honor cloure per segon any la presentació de l'edició anual del vostre anuari internacional. Enmig de l'actual conjuntura, comptar amb aportacions d'experts ens permet aprofundir en l'anàlisi imprescindible si no ens volem equivocar en el moment de prendre decisions. Quin futur ens espera? Aquesta és d'alguna manera la pregunta que corre a través de tots els articles, els capítols d'aquest anuari i d'alguna manera també el diàleg d'avui. Una pregunta que com a societat per força ens interpel·la i ens obliga a actuar no només sobre les problemàtiques concretes del present, sinó també amb una visió a llarg termini, conscients que les receptes del passat ja no serviran pels desafiaments que se'ns presenten avui dia. És una consideració vàlida per la política internacional i ho és també per les polítiques públiques, com bé ho demostren alguns dels temes que hem abordat aquí avui. I sense cap voluntat d'exhaustivitat sí que voldria posar en relleu alguns elements que em semblen rellevants per entendre la dimensió dels canvis que tots plegats hem d'entomar. L'anuari ens planteja aquest triple desafiament geopolític, climàtic, tecnològic. Pel que fa a la geopolítica, estem experimentant en temps real un canvi sistèmic en la manera d'entendre les relacions internacionals, en la presa en consideració de les regles i dels valors que han sustentat aquestes relacions. Un canvi que es produeix després de dècades de cooperació, de col·laboració global, malgrat molts desequilibris, del foment del multilateralisme, d'un comerç internacional basat en regles prou objectives, del desplegament de polítiques de cooperació al desenvolupament, de l'establiment d'aliances regionals i d'acords a diferents nivells. Estem potser davant la fi d'un sistema de la gestió del món que amb totes les seves mancances i amb totes les seves injustícies ens havia portat o ens ha portat a nivells de progrés i de pau mai coneguts fins a aquell moment. Un model que ha consolidat el dret internacional, els drets civils i polítics, que ara en canvi es veuen contestats. El contesten en primer lloc i abans que ningú grans potències emergents, com també alguns dels països que giren al seu entorn. I d'altra banda, es contesta també el concepte de democràcia suprema o de supremacia de la democràcia, però sobretot es contesta el dret dels països democràtics a denunciar la falta de llibertats en aquestes noves potències i la idoneïtat dels sistemes democràtics per donar solucions als problemes complexes del món contemporani. El fet desestabilitzador és la recent confrontació, quan no la simple negació d'aquests principis i d'aquests valors per part d'alguns dels estats històricament alineats en la defensa de la democràcia i la seva justificació des de corrents intel·lectuals i de pensament teòricament defensors de l'ordre i de l'estabilitat. Aquest retorn a la llei del més fort provoca un canvi estructural en la relació transatlàntica, un canvi que no apareix de cop, un canvi que és el resultat d'una evolució llarga i constant, però és veritat, té raó Enrico Letta quan sentencia que els resultats de les últimes eleccions americanes han esvaït qualsevol rastre d'optimisme. Ja no podem parlar d'un accident de la història, hem de parlar d'una tendència profunda, arrelada, destinada a perdurar amb Trump o sense. Un canvi de les relacions transatlàntiques que posa al descobert les fragilitats estructurals d'Europa, una defensa delegada, una estabilitat financera dependent i una base industrial insuficient. Seria un error pensar que aquest període és transitori, anem envers un xoc de models del que només podrem sortir ben parats si som capaços de reinventar la Unió Europea i adaptar-la a un món pel qual no havia estat creada. En relació al segon desafiament que assenyala l'anuari, el tecnològic, cal subratllar la gran capacitat de transformació i de mutació que augura canvis disruptius en la manera d'entendre les nostres societats, de relacionar-nos i d'incorporar la intel·ligència artificial en tot allò que fem i que som. La revolució tecnològica, la revolució digital, es presenta al mateix temps com a instrument i com a potencial amenaça si esdevé un fi en si mateix. Les constants innovacions deixen els centres d'anàlisis i els governs amb una capacitat de reacció limitada i, per contra, fan especialment rellevant la capacitat d'anàlisi i d'anticipació. Sobre aquesta qüestió, l'anuari profunditza en la vulnerabilitat estructural que suposa la dependència tecnològica europea. Des d'Europa liderem la regulació digital, però sotmesa a una pressió cada cop més forta, i continuem depenent de tecnologies crítiques externes, sense les quals és impossible assegurar el sosteniment de la nostra qualitat de vida. Disposem d'investigadors excel·lents, disposem d'un ecosistema de start-ups vibrant, però no hem estat capaços de crear un mercat interior de la indústria tecnològica, tenim escassa capacitat de computació pròpia i vivim en la incapacitat de transformar les nostres idees en projectes viables a nivell mundial. Mentre la Xina desplega plans industrials amb inversions massives i planificació a llarg termini, i mentre els Estats Units utilitzen sense complexos les eines comercials per defensar la seva economia, la Unió Europea depèn de les importacions per tecnologies crítiques com les bateries o els semiconductors. I arribats en aquest punt, sense decisions ràpides, Europa pot arribar a perdre fins i tot la seva base industrial, la base que necessita per garantir la seva pròpia seguretat econòmica i energètica. I el tercer desafiament que subratlla aquest anuari és el climàtic. N'hem parlat. La comunitat científica fa temps que alerta sobre aquest punt de no retorn en l'augment de les temperatures que comportarà el desplaçament forçós de milions de persones. L'Agència Internacional de l'Energia descriu un panorama paradoxal. La demanda global d'energia va créixer un 2,2% en el 2024 en comparació amb l'any anterior, motivat precisament per l'augment de les temperatures, que van batre un nou rècord mundial, però també per l'elevadíssima demanda d'electricitat que requereix la digitalització i, per consegüent, la necessària transició tecnològica per no deixar ningú enrere. Políticament, el consens en favor de les energies netes s'està reforçant en països com la Xina, la Índia i altres socis del sud global, però es qüestiona cada vegada més. Els Estats Units i els governs europeus, alguns governs europeus, comencen també a arrossegar els peus. El canvi climàtic ens remet a les condicions físiques de la nostra existència, però no es pot desvincular tampoc d'un altre repte, el repte democràtic, que suposa l'ascens de l'extrema dreta, l'ascens dels populismes en general. I tot això connecta amb l'arrel socioeconòmica d'aquest malestar, un element incòmode però imprescindible de reconèixer. Andrea Arvizzi ho sintetitza en el seu llibre La era de la revanxa, on a partir de l'anàlisi de Thomas Piketty i d'altres autors explica que la desigualtat ha repuntat des dels anys 80 després de dècades de reducció. Molts ciutadans veuen com s'eixampla la distància amb unes èlits cada vegada més riques, generant una sensació de retrocés, d'inseguretat i de pèrdua de futur. Els governs tenim, en aquest cas, una gran responsabilitat per oferir projectes creïbles i recuperar l'atenció sobre les condicions materials de vida. La recent victòria de Zoran Mamdani a l'alcaldia de la ciutat de Nova York s'ha basat en el 84% del vot de dones menors de 29 anys i del 68% en el cas dels homes. Dades que demostren que els joves sí es poden mobilitzar, com també es va comprovar en les recents eleccions als Països Baixos, on el partit liberal D66 es va imposar a l'extrema dreta de Geert Wilders. El missatge és clar. Europa està en un punt d'inflexió històric, ho diu, ens ho explica l'anuari, ens ho confirma la realitat, o avancem cap a una Europa capaç d'actuar o altres prendran les decisions que ens interpel·len. I acabo recordant que el paper de Catalunya en aquest nou escenari també s'entén a la llum d'aquest triple desafiament. Catalunya no vol ser espectadora en aquest món convuls, no pot ser espectadora en aquest món convuls. Volem ser un actor que contribueix, que coopera, que proposa solucions, impulsant una acció exterior en tots els seus àmbits, amb un compromís inequívoc amb el dret internacional, amb la democràcia, amb els drets humans, treballant amb altres governs, amb altres ciutats, amb xarxes multilaterals, sabent que avui moltes de les respostes es construeixen des de la col·lectivitat. Defensem una Unió Europea més forta, més coherent i més ambiciosa. I permeteu-me acabar amb una idea central del pròleg de l'anuari: Europa no tindrà una segona oportunitat. Som en un moment en què cal passar del desig a la decisió, ens calen menys declaracions i més capacitat d'acció, més unitat, més coratge i més visió. Europa pot triar entre gestionar la seva vulnerabilitat o convertir el seu projecte polític en una proposta universal de llibertat, de dignitat i de prosperitat. I nosaltres, des de casa nostra, hauríem de ser al costat d'aquesta Europa que decideix, d'aquesta Europa que protegeix, que innova i que no renuncia a liderar. Gràcies al CIDOB novament per la feina que feu. Oferir informació veraç i contrastada és essencial per dotar-nos de democràcies més fortes i més cohesionades. En temps confusos, aquesta tasca, aquesta labor és clau perquè la ciutadania tingui les eines necessàries per informar-se de manera lliure i formar-se les seves pròpies opinions. Enhorabona i moltes gràcies.